Good evening and welcome. My name is Loretta Lyons. I'm the programming librarian at Guilford Free Library. Our talk tonight features Guilford resident Cornelia Buersdorf. She will be discussing Connecticut's laws on slavery from 1643 to 1848. This program is part of an ongoing series co-sponsored by the local initiative Witness to History, Slavery in Guilford. If you'd like to ask a question at the end of the talk, please use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. And now I'm going to turn it over to Doug Nygren, Chair of Witness to History, Slavery in Guilford, who will be introducing our speaker. Doug?
Thank you, Loretta. And thank you, Guilford Free Library, for being a co-sponsor of this evening's talk. I'm Doug Nygren, Chair of the GPA's Witness to History, Slavery in Guilford initiative. Our mission is to uncover the missing history of slavery in Guilford and to share with you what we find. Before I introduce our speaker for tonight, I'd like to thank John Callio of our team for designing our poster. I'd also like to direct all of you to our website, www.slaveryinguilford.org, slaveryinguilford.org. There you will find the posters John has designed for all the talks that we've had at the library. In a few days, tonight's talk will join them, and you will have access to them. But even before it is there, you can go to our website and find a written timeline for slavery laws in Connecticut that our speaker for tonight has provided. Our speaker is Cornelia Buersdorf. She is a Guilford resident, a licensed lawyer in Germany. She and her husband have 3 children who are attending or have attended Guilford Public Schools. She and her husband grew up in Germany, where she studied law and he particle physics. In Germany, the course of study to become a lawyer can take 6 to 9 years. Cornelia did that and was an accredited lawyer there when the family moved to Guilford. To continue her career here, she had to study American law, which she did at the University of Connecticut Law School, where for one of her classes, she researched and wrote a paper on Connecticut's laws concerning slavery. From that paper and further research, tonight's talk emerged. Would you all join me in welcoming Cornelia Buersdorf?
Thank you very much, Doug, for the introductions, and thank you, Loretta, for hosting this event. I'm so happy to be here and to talk to you about the Connecticut laws that concerned the lives of enslaved people, that regulated slavery, and that finally enacted the abolition of slavery pretty late. But in 1848, Connecticut was finally getting rid of enslaved people. But before I dive into any laws, I wanted to start with a Supreme Court decision from 1837, 10 years before slavery was abolished. And this decision is called Jackson versus Bullock. And I want to tell you about this because the court is referring to a variety of laws that we will encounter in this talk, and it will help us to understand them and to interpret them. And I'm going to tell you the story of Nancy Jackson, the main figure in that decision. She was a woman enslaved by Bullock. She was born in Georgia in 1813 and brought to Connecticut in 1835, where she was staying at the family residence in Hartford and serving the family as a slave, while Bullock, her master, went back and forth from Georgia to Hartford. And in 1837, Bullock wanted to take her back to Hartford, but Nancy was lucky. She had a very good friend, a former slave and freedom activist, James Morse, and he applied for a writ of habeas corpus, and the court had to decide if Nancy Jackson was a free woman or had to go back to Georgia. And The judge who wrote the decision was named Thomas Scott Williams, and he had a lot to say about this. He started off with examining the state of slavery in Connecticut. And at that time, in 1837, 10 years before slavery was abolished, he explains, and I'm citing from the decision, "Every human being has a right to liberty as well as to life and property, and to enjoy the fruit of his own labor. That slavery is contrary to the principles of natural right and to the great law of love. That it is founded on injustice and fraud and can be supported only by provisions of positive law." By saying that, he refers to an earlier decision from England from 1772, a pretty famous decision called Somerset versus Stuart, in that Chief Justice Lord Mansfield famously declared, and I'm citing again, that slavery is so odious that nothing can be suffered to support it but positive law. And so Judge Williams in the Jackson versus Bullock decision said two things here. He said that first, that slavery is against natural law. So today we would say slavery is against the human law of human dignity, the human right of human dignity. And the other thing he said is that only positive law can really justify the existence of slavery, even though it has become immoral. So positive law is law that has been enacted by a legislative body and that stays on the book even when the basic reasons when it was enacted became immoral. And then Judge Williams was looking for positive laws in Connecticut that would legalize slavery, and he couldn't find any. He stated that there were no positive laws that instituted slavery directly, but he also said, and I'm citing again, he said that slavery probably crept in silently until it became sanctioned by custom or usage, but that the system of slavery has been to a certain extent recognized by various statutes that regulate, modify, and strive to abolish slavery, and thus it had found an implied sanction. So what he is saying is we have a body of laws, or we had a body of laws in Connecticut that pertain to the institution of slavery in various ways. And this body of law altogether was a justification for the institution of slavery and was on the book. And so slavery was still somehow legal. And further on, he goes to examine how it applied to Nancy Jackson's case. And I will come back to this decision throughout the talk a couple of times. But now I'm going to show you all the laws that we are going to cover. So we have 6 topics of laws, and I try to categorize these topics also by time. So we start in the 1600s with fugitive laws. Then we go to liability laws for masters freeing slaves. That's called manumission laws, because manumission for setting slaves free or setting servants free. And then we have slave codes. These were criminal laws with discriminatory punishments for Black and Native Americans. And then we have slave trade limitations. These were the first steps toward abolition. Then we have gradual abolition laws, and then we have the final abolition laws in 1848. Before I start with the fugitive laws, I also wanted to caution a little bit. I like to think of laws as a mirror of society. The laws give us an impression on how society was supposed to function by the lawmakers, by the people who enacted the laws. But this image is distorted because a lot of times we cannot really say how society really functioned just by looking at the laws. It is not enough. Oftentimes laws were not enforced, or we don't know how they were enforced. Sometimes there were old laws that stayed on the books, or laws were on the books that were never really used. Sometimes customs were never put into writing, and when the zeitgeist changes, the laws are usually the last ones to change. And so now let's start with the fugitive laws. So the first laws, the first positive law that I encountered and is often cited as the first fugitive law are the Articles of Confederation of the United Colonies of New England. These were Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. And in section 8, and I'm citing from the law, it says, "It is also agreed that if any servant run away from his master into any other of these confederated jurisdictions, the said servant shall be delivered either to his master or any other pursues and brings a certificate of proof." So this meant basically that if you had a servant who ran into another country, colony, the officials of Connecticut could then ask the officials of the other colony, like for example Massachusetts, to help them to bring their fugitive servant back. And it is also believed that this law probably applied also to Native Americans. And this is the first fugitive law. So I want to present also the Code of 1650, which is technically not a fugitive law, but a slave trade law, but it's very close to a very early law that pertained actually to Native Americans and that you were not supposed to trade with them. But it had a very interesting provision in it that legalized the slave trade somehow, because it stated that basically to secure the peace in the colony, any Native American that was in any way hostile to the colonists could be captured and put into servitude, or to be shipped out and exchanged for a Black person. So this really started off the slave trade, or at least put it into writing, even though it probably existed even before this. I'm not really sure. But at the end of the century, we have the first Connecticut law that was really put into place to prevent, to capture fugitives. It was the act to prevent a running away of, and I cite, Indian and Negro servants. And it was enacted, and I'm partly citing from it, that a Negro or Indian servant or servants who were wandering out of town bounds or places to which they did not belong without having a ticket, that they were called runaways, and every person inhabiting in this colony could seize them and bring them back to their master or owner, who was then obliged to pay for the cost. And also ferrymen would have to pay a fine if they transported any such person without having a certificate. So this reminded me of laws where when you find an item that was lost or didn't but belonged to somebody, you were obliged to bring this back to the owner and then get a finder's fee. It really sounds, or it really shows that these persons, these servants, were treated like items, like a thing, like a property. And it is, if you think about it that way, it is no surprise that fugitive laws were the first positive laws that implied the institution of slavery, because it implied that somebody had the right or wanted to claim people as their own, as their property, as a thing. Because property laws, or anything that you have a right to own, is not worth anything if you can't enforce it. So you have to have an enforcement mechanism that protects your interest in owning a thing. And these fugitive laws are really is really an enforcement mechanism, and is really necessary for anybody who wants to realize a right, or a right that they want to have on owning a person. So fugitive laws are the first laws, and they are also, as we will see, laws, the last battlegrounds before the abolition of slavery. Fugitive laws are upholding the interests of the slave owner. And now going to the next one, we have manumission laws. laws about the freedom to free slaves. And these laws were not in the interest of the slave owner, they were in the interest of the towns. Because around 1700, and there were already for decades enslaved people serving in Connecticut, and the masters wanted to get rid of them. They became old, maybe they were not productive anymore, and so they were let go. But what happens to enslaved persons who were never allowed to earn anything, who couldn't save up anything, who maybe didn't even have relatives? There were no free Black communities in Connecticut. They were just very, very poor. And there was a law on the books from 1672 that obliged the town to provide living expenses or the basic needs for poor people. The towns really didn't want to pay for all the freed minorities, to say that, basically, because so the towns had the idea of putting a law into place that obliged the masters who freed their slaves to pay for them, for their living expenses, should they become poor. So I can also read from that. It stated that all slaves set at liberty by their owners and all Negro, mulatto, and Spanish Indians who are servants to masters for time, in case they shall come to want after they shall be so set at liberty, or the time of their service to be expired, they shall be relieved at the cost of their master. So in other words, as I said, when you manumit a slave and the slave will be poor, you still had to pay for the living expenses. And also note that it didn't apply to white indentured servants. But in 1711, the towns realized that they need enforcement mechanisms as well, because if the masters freed their slaves and don't pay for them, the town still had to pay, and they wanted to be reimbursed by the former owners. And so they put a law into place that allowed them to sue the masters or their heirs or their estates or the administrator of the estate to get reimbursement for any enslaved person that they had freed, even if it was decades ago, and now the person would be poor and they still want the money. And this payment obligation was very discouraging for slave owners to free their slaves, because they always had to pay for them if they would become poor. And this payment obligation, they couldn't get rid of it until 1784, when the towns, in the wave of early abolition laws or gradual abolition laws that we are going to get into it, that the towns provided certificates for manumission. These were exemption forms for the masters. If the town, at their discretion, figured that the person to be freed is healthy enough and will probably not become poor, they could give a certificate. And in 1792, the discretion of the towns was actually limited. They had to give out certificates if the person to be freed was of a healthy condition and in a healthy age, like not too young and not too old. So next one, slave codes. These are enforcement mechanism these are actually criminal laws to uphold the status quo. So we've seen the first laws, the fugitive laws, were in the interest of the slaveholder. The second one were in the interest of the town. This one is in the interest of the public of holding up the status quo. They probably people were afraid of resistance and revolts, and they were going around, but so they really wanted to keep their servants in check, and these laws were very discriminatory. So we have 2 or 3 around 1700. There was a set of curfew laws where servants were not allowed, or slaves were not allowed, to go out after dark, after 9 p.m., unless they were sent by their master. They were also not allowed to congregate in other houses. so that they couldn't discuss any revolt or any resistance. Then we have special punishments for breaking the peace, and later on in 1730 we had special punishments for defamation. So what's special about these laws is that any person, nobody was supposed to use defamatory words or to break the peace, but the punishments for Black and Native Americans, if they would do so, was whipping instead of a fine. And the same with the curfew laws. The punishment was whipping, but if a minor or anybody under a guardianship would go out, because they were under the curfew laws as well. So any minor, anybody under guardianship, these were apprentices and wives. They were also not allowed to go out after 9 p.m., but if they did so without special permission, they would just get a money fine. These slave codes were repealed in 1797 at a time when slavery had become immoral and when gradual abolition laws were already in place, and basically when the repeal of these slave codes hurt nobody, and you could safely repeal it. All right, so the next one, a little bit more uplifting because we're in the 1770s, and at that time public opinion about slavery had slightly shifted. Many persons came to think of slavery as an evil or a sin that had to do with the freedom movement of that time and with an early abolitionist movement. And we have seen this in the Somerset case, where the judge in England gave James Somerset, the slave in that case, a right of a habeas corpus case. So that was also going on in New England, and that we have more people going to court trying to get their freedom, especially in Massachusetts at that time. But in Connecticut, the activists failed to get a law enacted to abolish slavery altogether, like Vermont did, and Massachusetts came later. But at least they managed to limit the slave trade. The Connecticut legislature implemented a law in 1774, a so-called Non-Importation Act, to stop the increase of enslaved persons in Connecticut. And in 1788, they limited this even further, that no resident of Connecticut was allowed to support any slave trading vessel. And in 1792, they prohibited the export. So the text of the 1774 Non-Importation Act stated, and I'm citing, and whereas the increase of slaves in this state is injurious to the poor and inconvenient, be it further enacted that no Indian, Negro, or mulatto slave shall at all time hereafter be brought or imported into the state by sea or land from any place or places whatsoever, to be disposed of, left, or sold within the state. And at this point, I want to go back to our decision from the beginning, Nancy Jackson versus Bullock, where Judge Williams had to decide, with the other judges in the court, of course, whether Nancy Jackson was free or not. And this provision of 1774 was a main one that he examined. And he started off with mulling over what the phrase, and whereas the increase of slaves in this state is injurious to the poor and inconvenient, meant, because Bullock's lawyer argued that this statute didn't really apply to Nancy at all, because the legislature wanted to prevent an increase of paupers and not an increase of slaves. But Judge Williams interpreted the statute, and I think rightly so, that the legislature did not want any more slaves in this state, because they thought it was bad news for poor people. Because, and I cite what Judge Williams said in the opinion, Slave labor would then be brought into competition with the labor of poor whites, tending to reduce the price of their work and to prevent their employment and to bring the free laborer in some measure into the ranks with slaves. And here we have a new interest of the lawmakers, the interest to support poor whites and also the towns who had to support the poor whites if they couldn't support themselves, as he said in the manumission laws. So to support the poor whites and their opportunities to find good work. So the lawmakers did not say, and whereas slavery is against the natural law or something like that. No, they said, whereas the increase of slaves in this state is injurious to the poor and inconvenient. So the next thing that Judge Williams looked at was the provision in this in the 1774 law to be left within this state. He was wondering if Nancy was left in this state and Bullock then violated the Non-Importation Act that way. And he came to the conclusion that no slave, and I'm citing again, should be brought from any place and suffer to remain in this state. So what he said is that you could bring in a slave when you travel, but only for a reasonable time that the traveling takes place. So if you had to change horses and maybe visit for a short time some family members, short time back then was maybe a month, but that would maybe be okay. And he wasn't very specific what time was okay, but he said clearly 2 years was too long. So because if it wasn't too long, it would undermine this statute and it would undermine the goal that Connecticut really didn't want to increase their slave population. Otherwise, all the slaveholders from somewhere else could bring in their slaves and could stay with them here for a longer time period. And then we would have more enslaved people. And that's not really what Connecticut wants. But before he could really tell whether or not Nancy was free, he looked at the next set of laws. And he looked at the gradual abolition laws here. So I want to tell you a little bit about those that I call feel-good laws, because in 1784, Connecticut finally found a compromise that the lawmakers could live with. And they enacted, and I'm citing, an act concerning Indian, mulatto, and Negro servants and slaves, that stated, and I'm citing again, be it enacted that no Negro or mulatto child that shall, after the first day of March 1784, be born within this state, shall be held in servitude longer than until they arrive at the age of 25 years, notwithstanding the mother or parent of such child was held in servitude at the time of its birth. But such child at the age of foresaid shall be free, any law, usage, or custom to the contrary notwithstanding. So in other words, a Black child born after March 1st, 1784 had to be released from servitude at the age of 25. And we have a follow-up law from 1797 that stated that the age of freedom was 21 years for persons born after 8/1/1797. So why gradual abolition, and why did the lawmakers were so happy about this law? Well, because they could give abolitionists a concession. They could say, hey, look, we get it, slavery is big evil and a sin and whatnot, and we want to get rid of it as well. But at the same time, they were upholding the interests of the slave owners because nobody was freed by this law. Only babies born after March 1st, then 25 years later would be freed, but nobody was freed in 1784. So slave owners were fine. Upholding interests of the town. Yeah, well, the towns didn't have to pay anything right now. It supported poor whites, no more increase of slaves, and it avoided backlash. So it didn't really hurt anybody except for the enslaved persons, but when did anybody listen to them, right? So it was a feel-good law. Everybody could pat themselves on the back and be happy that they did something really good. And they were not alone. We have Pennsylvania enacting a gradual abolition law in 1780, Rhode Island in 1784, New York in 1799, and New Jersey in 1804. And our Judge Williams in Jackson versus Bullock was also pretty proud. And he said, the Act of 1774 aimed a blow at the increase of slaves. That of 1784 struck at the existence of slavery. The former was intended to weaken the system, the latter to destroy it. The former lopped off a limb from the trunk, the latter struck a deadly blow at the root. And Judge Williams said Bullock would undermine that law and the goal of the legislature if he could take Nancy back. And so Judge Williams set her free. But nevertheless, even though everybody was so proud of that law, it did not free anybody. And if you're wondering whether or not a child born after March 1st, 1784 was still an enslaved child or a servant child, actually the Connecticut Supreme Court made that clear in another decision that I'm not going to get into it right now, is Windsor versus Hartford, 1817. And the court stated clearly children born after March 1st, 1784 were servants and not slaves. They could take up residence in the town of their masters. Yeah, okay. So let's go to the next set of laws, the long road to final abolition. I call it that because in the end, it took over 60 years from our first gradual abolition law. And if you count the Non-Importation Act as the first step toward abolition, it's actually over 70 years until we have a final abolition law. But the Connecticut lawmakers were really content with what they had achieved in the first half of the 19th century. And I pulled up some numbers of enslaved people in Connecticut that showed that the legislative scheme actually worked from their point of view. As I said, the only people that really suffered were the ones that were not freed. But the lawmakers, they said, well, that works. So in 1770s, there were more than 6,000 enslaved persons in Connecticut. The 1790 census stated 2,648. The 1800 census stated 951. In 1810, there were 310, 1820, 92, and 1840, 17. So in 1818, so when the census showed 92 persons, so maybe there were 100 persons enslaved in Connecticut. And in 1818, Connecticut enacted a new constitution. And they could have outlawed slavery right then and there because they have seen in Vermont, slavery was outlawed by the Constitution. In Massachusetts, indirectly by the Constitution because the court interpreted the Constitution that way. But Connecticut wrote in Section 1 of the 1818 Constitution, we declare, and I cite, that all men, when they form a social compact, are equal in rights, and that no man or set of men are entitled to exclusive public emoluments or privileges from the community. So Connecticut had the language of the social compact in that, and our Judge Williams had something to say about that. And I cite, the language of the 1818 Constitution is not as broad as that of the Bill of Rights in Massachusetts, to which it has been compared. It seems evidently to be limited to those who are parties to the social compact thus formed. Slaves cannot be said to be parties to that compact or to be represented in it. So Connecticut did not outlaw slavery through the Constitution. And there is also a Supreme Court decision from New Jersey, State versus Post in 1845 that referred, that mentioned a possible abolition through the Constitution, but the Supreme Court said, and in New Jersey it was also not abolished, But the Supreme Court said, well, had it been abolished through the Constitution of New Jersey, then the obligation of the masters to pay for the freed slaves would have been non-conformative to the Constitution. So we don't know why Connecticut did not abolish slavery through the Constitution. My wild guess is they didn't think it was necessary. But maybe then we would have had legislation about the manumission laws. Anyway, another thing I wanted to bring up, and it wasn't really stated in the beginning, but I found when I prepared the talk that I should really bring this up. And these are compliance laws with the federal fugitive acts. And I said in the beginning, the fugitive laws were really central to the right to own slaves, or to realize that right. And so it was the latest, so the last battleground about the legality of slavery were the fugitive laws. And so there were a couple federal fugitive laws. There was the Fugitive Slave Act from 1793, federal law, where slave owners from states could claim their fugitives back from other states if they had crossed the border. But this law was not very effective, because free states such as Connecticut, Pennsylvania, the residents helped the fugitives, and state officials and lawmakers helped them as well. And so there was a US Supreme Court decision in 1842, Prigg versus Pennsylvania, where the Supreme Court declared that state officials should not have any say in the enforcement of federal law, and they should just stay out of it. And then we have the Fugitive Slave Act from 1850, with strong enforcement mechanism that made the free states really, really unhappy, and they really didn't like it. So when we look at Connecticut's compliance laws, there is the 1838 law that complied with the federal fugitive law from 1793, but it had court procedures, pretty detailed court procedures written, where the slaveholder must go through. The slaveholder must provide proof through the courts, and sometimes even a jury trial, to get a certificate, and only with this certificate he could get the fugitive back. So it was pretty much a habeas corpus, a case for the fugitive in Connecticut. And the slaveholders didn't like it. So after Prigg, Connecticut had to implement that decision and took out the state officials out of the enforcement mechanism. And in 1854, we have an act for the defense of the liberty in this state. And that act punishes people, any person who falsely declares a free person to be a slave. So if you lie about a person and say it's a fugitive, while this person really is a free person, you'd have to pay $5,000 and 5 years in Connecticut state prison. So that really shows that Connecticut was not happy about the federal fugitive laws. So that's pretty much it. Here is a final timeline, and we can walk through this again. So we have the fugitive laws in the 1600s that supported the interests of the slave owner. We have the manumission laws that secured the interests of the towns. Then we have the slave codes cementing the institution of slavery and trying to minimize the resistance and revolts. We have the slave trades, the first steps toward abolition and stopping the increase of slaves. Then we have the gradual abolition laws, the feel-good laws, the big compromise that didn't free any slaves. And then we have the final abolition laws through positive laws. So yeah, that was it. The laws are on the website. I recommend reading into them. It's a lot. There's also a lot that I haven't said, and there's a lot that I'm not really aware of. And everything is a rabbit hole. You can get into it and research and make your own connection. And it's quite interesting and a little bit overwhelming. Well, thank you for your participation and your patience. And thank you again for the Guilford Library for hosting and for Doug giving me the opportunity to speak here.
Thank you so much, Cornelia. That was an amazing talk and a lot to kind of digest. So I'm hoping if anyone has a question, we'll take a minute here. If you'd like to post a question in the Q&A, we'll give everyone a chance if they have any. I know that's a lot of information to kind of synthesize and come up with a question. So let's see if anyone has any. While we're waiting for the audience, Cornelia, how much time did this take to research this timeline and all of the cases that you mentioned? Was this part of your work as a student and that you build upon that?
Yes, I wrote a research paper comparing the abolition of slavery in Connecticut and in Massachusetts, because by reading in class, I found that the topic was fascinating, because Connecticut and Massachusetts, they grew up together, right? If you go really back to the history, and then all of a sudden, what happened? Connecticut abolished slavery like more more southern northern states, like Pennsylvania, New York, through gradual abolition, while Massachusetts abolished slavery, and there's a little bit of a discussion how exactly and when and why, but basically in 1783 there were a set of court decisions and judicial review where the Supreme Court of Connecticut, of Massachusetts, declared slavery to be incompatible with the newly enacted Massachusetts Constitution. So whether or not the lawmakers intended this, the Supreme Court of Massachusetts said this language had to be, can be, or should be interpreted to mean that also that everybody should be free, that we can't have enslaved persons. And then I looked at all the laws that made it so, so different, and Connecticut had a lot of laws regulating slavery, and the manumission laws were, I thought, key, because in 1702 or 3, you can really find out the exact date, Massachusetts also had a manumission law, but they never had the enforcement law. They never had the law that the towns could sue the masters to get reimbursed. And so there was a lot of manumission going on, and they had very early poor laws, and they had a big community of freed Blacks that supposedly people from Connecticut fled to connect with a community in Massachusetts. And that community was also vital in an abolition movement that feeded cases to the courts. And then finally, they pushed so much until the Massachusetts Supreme Court abolished slavery through judicial review, although the Massachusetts Constitution helped, the language on that helped.
We do have a few questions coming in. If I'll just stop you right there so we can get to, so that's okay. So Stephen Wolfson asks, were there any CT laws on slavery challenged in the federal courts?
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, okay. Question from Ellen Cordes. Can you please comment again on the federal ban on slave trade with a question mark for 1808?
Yeah, so these the only case that I had really looked at, so in the beginning, I I don't know if I said that, but my presentation is a little targeted on the Connecticut laws, and there are so many more, even Connecticut laws, but also, you know, federal laws, and the slave trade. So the international slave trade was forbidden, but it is one of these laws that was never really very well enforced. So in the beginning, we don't know if the laws were enforced or not. So that slave trade law was really badly, if not at all, not enforced. So if you look at some books that talk about slavery, that say like the slave ships were still coming in, there were lots of ships coming into New York Harbor, and the slave trade was happily going on. It was not really enforced. But there was one case that had a little bit to do with the international slave trade, and that was the Amistad case from New Haven, because that was finally decided by the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, well, you captured slaves from Sierra Leone, and you wanted to import them to the United States, and they came to New Haven because they revolted on the ship, and now you can't just take them, you know. They had to go back to and be freed and go back to Sierra Leone, because that was in violation of the international slave trade law.
A couple more questions, Cornelia. From Nick Wood, Massachusetts codified slavery in 1641. Did the inhabitants of Connecticut simply apply that law to their own colony informally?
We don't know if they implied it formally. Probably nobody really thought about it. I'm not sure that the Connecticut inhabitant, like the residents, really were aware of that. Maybe not, I don't know. But slavery was going on, and as Judge Williams said, it crept in silently, and then it became a custom, and then it was implied through positive laws, like these fugitive laws and the Code of 1650. So because technically laws from Massachusetts would not apply in Connecticut, but maybe they were implied and they were used. And so, as Judge Williams said, it crept in silently.
Question from Margaret Thomas, which is similar to a previous question. How does slave trade abolition by federal in 1807 contrast with Connecticut law?
Well, the Connecticut law in 1774 forbid the slave trade, like the importation of slaves. And the 1807 slave trade also forbid the whole trade. So I think they were comparable. I mean, they were not against each other. So you were not allowed to import any slaves, but so the language from the 1774 was to be disposed of or left or sold. So you could travel with your slaves through Connecticut. But then later in 1792, the export was also forbidden. So the international slave trade is when so it's kind of the same. You know, you're not allowed to import slaves.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
One final question from Tamara Lanier. Was the enslaver you discussed in the legal case named Bullock, which I think...
Yeah, his name was Bullock. I really didn't want to call him Mr. Bullock. Just called him Bullock. It's a little disrespect here.
Okay, I think that's all of our questions for tonight. Let me just double check.
So I can spell Bullock, B-U-L-L-O-C-H. A Scottish name, I looked that up.
All right, I think that's all of our questions for tonight. Thank you so much for such a thorough survey of the Connecticut laws on slavery. I appreciate everyone who joined. Oh, let me just see. I'm sorry there might be one more question here. Oh, thank you from John Blanton. So
Thank you.
thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And we'll try to get this recording up on the website in about a week or so. Okay. So have a good night, everyone. Thanks again.
Thank you.